Hey guys, it's Cam from Craft and Tailored. In this episode of What Is On My Wrist, we're talking Daytonas. This time we're talking 6265s, and this is commonly referred to as the Big Eyes Daytona. So let's get into the details and talk about why this is called the Big Eyes, and let's talk about the history behind the reference 6265. So if you are a fan of our channel and if you subscribe, you know that we've talked about pretty much every Daytona outside of a 6265, I'm pretty sure. I figured why not talk about a 6265. The Big Eyes reference 6265, or the nickname Big Eyes, is kind of an interesting variant and a bit more of a transitional Daytona for Rolex. So I figured why not take this opportunity, this magical opportunity, to talk a little bit more about the 6265. So what's interesting about this specific example as well, and one of the reasons why it's a little bit more transitional, is it is a Daytona, but it is a Daytona that does not say Daytona on the dial, which is also really interesting. So this is commonly referred to as an ROC, which is Rolex Oyster Cosmograph. And that's why you'll see in some cases watches out there that will be referred to as Rolex Daytona ROC. And the reason why is because underneath the coronet, you'll see Rolex Oyster there. What's interesting too about this specific dial variant is ROC, or Rolex Oyster Cosmograph, is a little bit lower. It's not as close to the coronet. And then the other thing is there's the absence of Daytona above the 6 o'clock subdial. The easiest way to tell if a dial is a Big Eyes or not is to actually look at the T Swiss T indication at the bottom or at the 6 o'clock position on the dial. And essentially you'll see that T Swiss T bends, but it almost appears to be like kind of squashed in between that 6 o'clock lume plot and kind of the bottom portion of that subdial. So these dials tend to have kind of these bigger subdials than, let's say, like a Big Red or something like that. So let's talk a little bit about the name Daytona and where that came from. The Daytona name came in 1964, in 1965, that kind of time frame, when Rolex decided to brand the Rolex Cosmograph references in order to appeal to the auto racing culture here in the United States. And it was also an official sponsor of the Daytona 500, which was held in Daytona Beach, Florida. So the Daytona quickly became a chronograph favorite among racing enthusiasts and has grown into a statement of prestige within the horological collecting community. You know, so again, that's kind of the history behind Daytona. Interestingly too, it's rumored that the Daytona may have been dubbed the Le Mans, but obviously there wasn't that kind of, passion, and there wasn't as much brand separation in the United States, or rather in Europe, as there would have been in the United States in that time frame. You had a lot of the F1 stuff, you had Hoyer, you had all these other watches. I think, Rolex branding and kind of choosing to ultimately use their watch and kind of sponsor the Daytona 500 was ultimately a good move. And even still to this day, matter of fact, if you win the Daytona 500, they give you, a Daytona, which is really cool. So let's talk a little bit about this 1974 reference 6265. Also, real quick, the difference between a Rolex 6263 and a 6265 is basically a 6263 has a acrylic or bakelite bezel, as opposed to the 6265, which is in steel. And same thing we can kind of see through like the earlier Daytonas, like a 6241 or a 6239. A 6241 obviously has, a bakelite bezel, whereas a 6239 has a steel bezel. So essentially it's the same watch under a different model name, but ultimately the only difference is that one has a steel bezel and one has a black, outer bezel. Outside of that, there's a lot of crossover between the two references, and basically they're the same watches throughout the range of the references, and Rolex offered that all the way up until the introduction of the Zenith Daytona. This 1974 reference 6265 is, like I was saying, a superb example, and again is often referred to as an ROC dial, basically meaning that it's Rolex Oyster Cosmograph on the top portion of the dial. What's really cool too is that the silver dial itself has basically this offset with the black subdials. This specific example, the subdials have kind of taken on like this deep, like chocolatey kind of brown, so it's kind of going slightly tropical. And the text within the subdials is actually silver and not white. So kind of a nice little variant there that you'll see in the Big Eye Daytonas, and kind of just, it catches the light just right. It's a nice little sub variant that I really I'm stoked on. This possesses its original Mark II pushers. So we see early Mark II, pushers, which is a nice thing to have, especially in Daytonas like this, because often they were swapped out during service intervals for like Mark III or just later service pushers. And the way that you can tell is basically the cap of the pusher does not have any lines or grooves in it. They're just, smooth. So we talked a little bit about how to tell a big eye from just a regular dial. Essentially, the Rolex Oyster Cosmograph text is a little bit lower. It kind of sits almost in between the two subdials, where it's a little bit higher on a big red. And then also, T Swiss T is basically sandwiched between the outer minute track and that lower subdial. So it's like real tight in there, and that's a good indicator of, a big eye. Let's talk a little tech spec real quick. You guys like the tech specs, and I understand it. The watch is actually 36 millimeters. So not many people realize that 6263s and 6265s are 36 millimeters. One of the reasons why people often confuse them with being a watch in the 40 millimeter range is it wears like a 40 millimeter on wrist. It doesn't wear really like a Datejust, or let's say like a 36 millimeter Rolex sport watch, maybe like a 1016 or something like that. It really kind of wears more like a 40. And I think the reason for that is because you have these screw down locking pushers, and then you also have a 7 millimeter, in this case, trip lock crown. So you've got a trip lock crown and these locking pushers, which kind of add a little bit of heft to the mid case. And then additionally, you have a bezel that kind of, sits out of the case a little bit. There's about a millimeter on each side of that bezel, and maybe almost up to 4 millimeters additional to the case when you're looking at 6263. So the other interesting thing too is Daytonas have a 19 millimeter lug width, whereas most other sports watches offered through Rolex have a 20 millimeter lug width. So subs and GMTs and 1016s and Explorer 2s from the same era will actually have a 20 millimeter lug width, whereas the Daytona has retained a 19 millimeter lug width. This specific example is on an Oyster bracelet. This specific bracelet is a 78150 with 571N pieces. And the 78350s again are 19 millimeters. There's a couple of different Oyster bracelets that you'll see with Daytonas. In the 70s, they basically went to this style of bracelet, which is a little bit heavier. It's not like a folded link bracelet. They actually did do them with folded link bracelets, as well as these kind of Oyster heavy bracelets. The other interesting thing too is that the bracelet taper went from 13 millimeters down to 16 millimeters. I prefer the 16 millimeter bracelets as opposed to like the 13 millimeter, but it kind of just depends on the watch. If I'm wearing like a 6239, I don't mind that 13 millimeter, taper. I think it's okay. Whereas like the 16 is a little bit, I guess more modern in terms of its feeling. So one thing also to note with the reference 6265 and the 6263 is they leverage Valjoux 727s, which we saw introduced with Rolex in the reference 6264 and 6262. We did a couple of videos on 6262s and 6264s. I'll provide a link in the description above and below so that you can check those out. But essentially a Valjoux 727 is, a movement that's higher beats per minute and a much more accurate movement as a result. So Rolex, again, kind of went away from the Valjoux 72s and into the 727s all the way until the introduction of the Zenith Daytona. So in any case, this example is a favorite of mine. Are you on the 6263 side of the fence? Are you on the 6265 side of the fence? Which one is your favorite? Let us know in the comments below. I kind of like both. I like both differently. An ROC dial and a Big Eyes Daytona like this, I love it in the 6265. I love the accent of the steel bezel in this watch specifically. But do I have a favorite? I'm not really sure. I kind of like them both differently, and it kind of also depends on dial variant. I really like 6265 with a steel bezel with a silver dial, whereas I like 6263s with black bezels and white subdials. So kind of interesting for me that I like both kind of differently with different dial formats, but let us know in the comments below what you think and what your preference is. As always, guys, thanks for tuning in. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you're not doing so already, be sure to check us out on Instagram at Crafted and Tailored. And if you've got watch questions, we are here and happy to help. Drop us a line at info@craftedandtailored.com. I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks for tuning in.